My name's Sid Foster. I'm the chairman of the London region of the CILT, and this evening is an extra meeting in our programme which is kindly sponsored by Tools Group, and our speaker tonight is going to be introduced by Martin, who's the MD, CEO, whatever.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening event sponsored by Tools Group, the CLT event with Lora Cecere. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tools Group, I think many of you are, but we're a demand-driven supply chain planning solution provider. 6 of the FTSE 100 companies use our solution for forecasting demand and modeling consumer behavior and driving that back through the supply chain so that we can plan distribution, manufacturing, and right back to supplier collaboration and forecasting. So it's a very topical, event for us this evening, with the demand-driven emphasis, which Laura will bring through from the description of the book as we go through. We're avid followers of Laura, I have to say. The demand message plays very, very well with our customers and the kind of problems that they're facing. And also, I think your championing of the best-of-breed providers and your independence from the big analyst companies, who we find are very supportive of the big ERP companies, who of course form the bedrock of most companies. But we believe that stifle some of the innovation which the best-of-breed companies are more famous for. And very pleased that Laura has often championed our case in that area. As an introduction to Laura, she comes originally from an operational background with Procter & Gamble and Kraft, amongst others, where she worked in engineering and operations. So certainly fair to say that she's got her hands dirty at the sharp end of supply chain. And worked for 8 years as an industry analyst with Gartner and AMR, and then latterly Altimeter, before founding her own supply chain company, Supply Chain Insights. And her blog, The Supply Chain Shaman, which I highly recommend, is one of the few that I read religiously on a regular basis when it comes out. She's here this evening to talk about her new book and first book, Bricks Matter, the first of many, we hope. So if you'd like to join me in welcoming Laura to the Met this evening.
Well, thank you very much. I'm kind of tethered here, so I'm going to put this down because I don't have any place to put it. So thank you for coming to hear the book, Bricks Matter. Has anybody read it? Oh, very good, delightful. So I'll tell you a little story about the book. I worked for AMR for many years, and I wrote about 600 articles on becoming demand-driven. And when I left AMR, I was very naive. I thought, it'd be no problem to write a book, that people would be, anxious for me to write a book. And so I wrote thesis after thesis, the Harvard Business Review, American Management Association, and said, I think I have this great idea for a book. And they're all like, very kind, but, thank you, but no thank you. And one person said to me, Laura, could you write this book and never use the word supply chain? And it just went to my core. I'm like, oh, what do you have against supply chain? I love supply chain. I've been working in supply chain for 30 years. Why do you not want a book on supply chain? And they said, because it's so boring. And it really made me stop and think about, we've made this topic very boring, right? We talk about tools and sheds, we talk our own language. And so I wrote this book to be the language of business. And I wanted to find out, it was the 30th anniversary of the first time that source, make, and deliver were put together under the term supply chain for commercial use. In 1982, it appeared in the first publication. Of course, we've had supply chain and logistics for many years. And so I was sitting talking to one of my best girlfriends, and, she's just a wonderful lady. And I said, they don't want to publish a book, supply chain, right? What will I call it? I said, bricks matter. And she said, that's the name of your book. So it's deliberately not supply chain. It's written to be the language of business. I started the effort in September 2011, and I started by interviewing 75 supply chain pioneers because I wanted to find out what those pioneers would have to say. And in fact, you in the audience was one of my pioneers that I interviewed. Thank you very much. And I asked the pioneers the same questions, and I really wanted to understand, we've been at this bit for 30 years. What have we accomplished? And when I first started, I thought that we had accomplished a lot, that we had reduced cost, improved customer service, and reduced inventory. And at a high level, what I found out, that we've done a lot of talking. At a project level, we reduced cost and we've improved inventory. But when we take it to the balance sheet, the only industry that has really reduced inventory and been resilient is high tech and electronics. And so you'll see in the data I'm going to show you that we've improved the revenue per employee, but we've really not really accomplished the mission that we started out with the original pioneers of using technology to really seize the opportunity of profitability and customer service. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that is. So welcome to my book. Thank you for coming. I'm going to show you some highlights of the book. So I work for a company called Supply Chain Insights. We do research, and a lot of the research in the book came from quantitative studies. And so you may see the quantitative studies that we do. We do 2 quantitative studies a month, and we also mine financial data. So for this, I built a database of 20 years of financial data of all public companies. And so I do a lot of work on social. You'll see me on Twitter. If you see these studies and something that you can give me an answer for, please let me know. And so a lot of these studies went into the book. Next. And so as we go into 2013, we're continuing it. We do plan to write ebooks this year. The ebooks will be free. I really am trying to be a missionary to try to help elevate the supply chain discussion. So as you look at all of the big data, disruptive technologies, evolution of metrics that matter, we're doing a lot of ongoing work, and there'll be 2 ebooks this year. Next. So this is part of the data that I collected. If you look at, first of all, the pioneers, it was very useful for me in listening to the stories of the 75 pioneers. The early days, the pioneers were all male, and they came out of engineering schools. And in those days, supply chain typically meant manufacturing and process industries, or it meant procurement in the discrete industries. And they operated as islands of information. I could not find data back this far to find out what the revenue per employee looked like. But in the next generation of pioneers, which I was part of, we started to get a little bit more diverse. And this is where we put the boots on the ground for emerging economies. And we learned from failure. In the book, I talk a lot about failure. Unfortunately, we had to dry up the aquifers in India before we learned that corporate social responsibility needed to be a large part of what we were doing. Unfortunately, we had to make a lot of mistakes with labor before we could learn that labor arbitrage wasn't the game in town. But you can see in this evolution where we were on revenue per employee. And these are averages by the industry. And then if we go to 2000, 2009, when we're past the e-commerce era, we start to see aggregation, consolidation of what we call the enterprise resource planning and advanced planning. You can see that we accelerate. But look at the difference between high-tech and electronics and chemical and consumer products and food. A lot of that is because we define supply chain too narrowly. In the consumer products and food divisions, we ran into a problem with supply chain being welcome to cross the functions of sales and marketing and to be able to really drive outside-in processes. And so the functional silos actually stopped some of the evolution of productivity and revenue per employee. And then you can see where we're at right now. Now, when I looked at all of the industries, I was very surprised. I really thought we had reduced cost, improved inventory. I mean, would people in the room think that too? Yeah. And so my big learning in writing the book was that people are not true to their balance sheets, and that we need, as supply chain practitioners, to be true to our balance sheets. So I'm going to show you some research. This is some research that I did for the book, and one of the things that I asked individuals was, where's your biggest issue in supply chain management? And it's all about data. You know, we've implemented systems that don't talk very well today, but the big surprise for me was this understanding of the executive team of supply chain management. And I actually find that, you know, the pioneers fought for a seat at the table, but when we got a seat at the table, we defined supply chain too narrowly. The supply chain department is often just logistics or distribution, and when we think about the original vision of source, make, deliver, and outside-in processes of value chains that go from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier, because of the narrow definition of supply chain as a department versus supply chain as a way of doing business, we limited the growth. The other thing is, many times supply chain will become supply chain applications, not necessarily supply chain as a way of doing business. And so this concept of the executive understanding of the supply chain is a barrier. So in the book, and it's written for the language of business, I talk about management of the supply chain as a system, and the fact that it's a complex system with increasing complexity. And one of the biggest things I would like you to teach students, if you're a teacher, is this idea of system thinking. In the first generation of pioneers, we had a lot of system thinking because they came out of engineering school. But in the third, fourth generation of pioneers, we're actually seeing that they're coming out of business school. And they don't understand these concepts of supply chain as a system. And we have a talent shortage today in the world, and most of the students are coming out of either North America or UK schools. And so, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to come tonight was to really push on, let's get into this supply chain as a system, and let's teach the students to speak the language of business and to be able to educate the executive teams around the issues of why they should care about supply chain. Next slide. So this concept of supply chain as a complex system in the book is in chapter 1. Next slide. And when we think about the trade-offs, one of the things that I do is I work with a lot of manufacturers and distributors around what is supply chain excellence? And it's a much easier question to ask than it is to answer. And many times people will have issues at the bottom of this, returns, waste, and these are symptoms. And if you look at management at the top, one of the biggest issues is the lack of clarity of supply chain strategy. 95% of companies are unclear about supply chain strategy, and one of the main issues around the failure of sales and operations planning is people don't know how to balance the trade-offs. We operate in functions, and there's lack of clarity of supply chain strategy. And so I often see the big consulting houses do supply chain strategy work, and I'll pull them aside and say, have you done this work before? Can we talk about what is supply chain strategy? And so as we think about supply chain as a system and how we manage the supply chain as a system to be able to look at profitability and growth and to be able to look at working capital. And now we have a new responsibility of corporate responsibility. And you'll see in the data that while 93% of companies have a corporate sustainability statement publicly, and 74% market sustainability as part of the brand, only 20% of companies are really looking at the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier to really look at corporate social responsibility and sustainability. And I think that is an opportunity for us to change the board level discussion to be able to look at these trade-offs differently and to be able to look at, you know, how do we design the supply chain? I believe that the movement from right product, right place, right time to people, profit, and planet, and that balance really changes the boardroom discussion, and we need to teach people how to have that discussion. And we need to teach people that supply chain's about more than just moving trucks. And then as we look at the R&D strategies and the asset strategies, as we've outsourced manufacturing, originally we had two buffers in the supply chain that absorbed demand and supply volatility. They were manufacturing and inventory. As we've outsourced manufacturing, it puts more pressure on inventory. And so we have to not just look at inventory cycles, we have to look at the form and function of inventory, and we have to design buffers and push-pull strategies. And it really raises the level of how we need to think about network design. And as we look at forecast accuracy, customer service, and inventory, We can pull benchmark data on inventory from the balance sheet, but there are no good metrics in benchmarking, in forecasting, and customer service. And let me tell you what I've learned. Customer service is a lot like a woman putting her weight on the driver's license. We never tell the truth, right? Everyone overstates customer service, right? And then there's no consistent metric for customer service. So from one company to another, or one division from another, it's, a shooting match, right? Forecast accuracy, everyone measures it differently. When I used to do benchmarking at AMR Research, I was like, the only way I trust forecast accuracy, if you give me your raw data and I will calculate it. So everything, the APQC data, all of the data in the world, the IBF data is very flawed benchmarking for forecast accuracy and customer service. So I said, how do I understand if we've made progress or not in supply chain? So I went to the balance sheet, and I couldn't get forecast, and I couldn't get customer service. So I call this the effective frontier, that for us to be able to make progress in supply chain, we have to move forward on this effective frontier, and we have to drive conscious choice. So I said, what could I get from the balance sheet? And so what I did was, next slide, I basically took the balance sheet and I said, these are the metrics that I think the boardroom cares about. And I broke them into growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And at first I started doing manual calculations of the Fortune 1000. And then I was able to build a database using one source and be able to get all publicly available information. And I looked at ratios, and the reason I looked at ratios is I wanted to be able to go across countries for currency and up and down based upon company size. And so what I did was I started mining the data at the intersection of growth, profitability, cost, and complexity to look at patterns, to understand what have we really done in 30 years of supply chain management. And so I'm going to show you some examples. Next slide. So this is a discussion on resiliency, right? We talk a lot about resiliency, but one of the things I wanted to see was how resilient were companies on cash-to-cash cycles versus gross margin. And look at consumer products. Consumer products is, if there was a 10 on supply chain maturity, you'd have high-tech and electronics at about 9, consumer products at about 7, and then pharmaceuticals would be about a 2. And look at how resilient consumer products is. You can see Colgate did better on gross margin than Procter & Gamble, but Procter & Gamble in the last couple of years has actually been able to push down their cash to cash. But look at this, right? This is a case study of lack of resilience coming out of the Great Recession. The pharmaceutical companies had this characteristic in this curve. Or if you look at Zimmer Holdings, which is a medical device company, not very resilient. Here's where we are with DuPont and Samsung, which I consider to be leaders. But in the chemical industry, you're going to see there was no company that rose above the rest on what I call the effective frontier of balancing growth, cost, cycles, and complexity. Next slide. So when we look at this and we look at the peer groups, one of the things that I found was the companies that had the highest margin actually did the worst on actually improving over the last 10 years. So the pharmaceutical companies, I said, were at the back of the pack. And then as we look at days of inventory, this is where they stacked up on average. And I'm going to show you some examples of where they are against their peer group. One of the things that was a real compelling fact for writing the book was when I worked at AMR, I worked 4 years on the supply chain top 25 from AMR. And I used to argue that you cannot put companies in a spreadsheet and shake them up, that they only can be compared against peer group because of the difference of rhythms and cycles in the value network. And so what I wanted to do as part of this research was better understand that. And I am an advocate now that I was absolutely right. So I will be telling you what I'm going to be doing about that as we go along. So next slide. So this is the chemical companies, right? This is an example where no one company stands out on the effective frontier. This is what they did over the course of growth and operating margins and days of inventory. You'll notice that many of them pushed up revenue per employee. So it was very much around productivity, but we did not reduce inventory. And we are now at what I call a plateau in terms of reducing cost. And I think the only way that we will drive us off of this horizontal plateau is for us to deal with supply chains as a system and elevate this to a boardroom discussion and deal with value chains. Next. So this is consumer electronics. Much better results. You can see Apple and Dell. Apple and Dell basically built supply chain into their operating systems. I'm a big fan of Samsung. Samsung has done a very good job of balancing cost and also inventory. I'll tell you a story. When I was at AMR, the most elevated discussion I ever had on forecasting came from the Samsung board. You know, my day was organized from call after call after call, and I had some Samsung on my diary, and I got on the phone and I introduced myself and I said, "Do you mind introduce yourself?" And they went around the room and it was the entire board of Samsung. And they asked me the question, what's the best metric for forecast accuracy? I've never had a board level discussion on forecast accuracy before, right? And so their focus on inventory, and of course we think about the high-tech and electronics industry, you know, the aging inventory is a big issue because of margin associated with the curve and the fact it has such a short life cycle. But this industry is the most advanced in planning, is the only industry that returned the margins after the Great Recession, and it's the only industry that I think is really moving at an accelerated rate on the use of technology. And I think that's a wake-up call for us. So next slide. And this is the consumer products industry that a lot of times people see as leaders. You can see that Procter & Gamble did the best on revenue per employee. Colgate and Palmolive actually did the best on return on assets, and the worst is Unilever. And I think there's a lot to learn from the Unilever case study. Unilever did a very good job on corporate social responsibility, but in terms of the evolution of Unilever, there was a lot of turnover of leadership, and there's a very loose governance of the regions, and so there was issues around product proliferation and rationalization around product lines. So in the book, in the background, we did all these slides to really look at companies and how they did. So let's just kind of go through these. So these are some slides where I was plotting the patterns so that you can see, you know, this is Unilever's progress on cash to cash versus gross margin. And one of the issues that actually happened here was as Unilever increased payables, they lost a lot of resiliency with their supplier base, very similar to what we saw in the automotive market. Next. This is food and beverage. My favorite company within food and beverage is General Mills. If we go next. Hershey actually is a case study of reducing inventory. They did it through leadership. A lot of times people will say, well, it's all about technology. I really write the book saying I think it does have to have technology, but overall it has to have leadership. Lots of these companies had technology and didn't drive results. Next slide. This is a case study of Kellogg versus General Mills. Clearly they're peer group comparative, but you can see that Kellogg sort of circled the drain, whereas General Mills actually reversed the operating margin, moved up the plateau. Now you might say, well, why did General Mills do that and not Kellogg? General Mills had continuity of leadership. Kellogg lacked continuity of supply chain leadership. General Mills is, I think, the best planning organization within food and beverage. And they designed the processes horizontally outside in, and they really tried to drive open innovation networks. And so the design of the horizontal processes, and in the book I talk about the fact that there are 4 horizontal processes that matter. Margin, the ability to look at revenue management holistically. So as we think about demand shaping, whether it's price, trade promotion, sales incentives, marketing, being accountable for that, and SG&A and margin management and revenue management. That's the first horizontal process. The second one is sales and operations planning, and I don't get into the debate of whether we're talking about IBP or S&OP. I think that that's all a waste of time. But true, robust S&OP that allows us to take the language of business into supply chain, and I'm talking about supply chain as it ties to the customer's customer, to the supplier's supplier, and supplier development. And then the fourth one is corporate social responsibility. So one of the things that we mined for the book were these kind of patterns to look at who did it best. Now, the pioneers said that they thought Procter & Gamble did it best. And I think Procter & Gamble did lots of good things. And then their second pick was Apple and Dell. But, it took me a year and a half to mine this data. The companies that I'm the most impressed with are Colgate, General Mills, and some of the high-tech and electronics companies. Yeah. Questions so far? Discussion? Interesting? Not interesting?
Interesting stuff. Look, Laura, can I ask you,
Yeah.
there was quite a difference in the numbers you had between Dell and Apple and the other electronics companies by a significant margin.
Right.
6-day cycles versus the next best was 45, I think it was. How do you explain that?
It's a different business model. So if you think about both Apple and Dell designed business models that would be negative cash to cash. So Dell started out an e-commerce model and they designed it that way. Apple also started out designing the business model that way. Samsung, who's more dependent on retailers, didn't have that luxury. And it's just the way the business was. The e-commerce guys will typically have negative cash flow. But if you look at the high-tech industry in terms of where they are on working capital versus others, they're the only industry that reduced inventory and cash to cash. Yeah? Other questions?
Yeah, Laura, those graphs, I'm just looking at those, but the question's similar for previous ones as well. Well, you've got a dramatic change in that curve.
Yes.
Is that down to something that the company was doing, or is that what would be the reason for that?
So this one, or?
Yeah, you see right at the end there, and then it was dramatic change in the trend.
Uh-huh, yeah. So both these companies are under tremendous commodity pressure in this period of time. If you think through what was happening with energy and corn, and also demand for cereal was pretty high. This particular company, which is Kellogg, right, sort of circled here and landed here, and they're about right here right now in 2012 returns. So you might say, well, what happened? Well, they tried to go global, but not really. They went into Latin America, but they set up regions very differently without really good corporate planning and governance. And they had a change in leadership here, here, and here, right? Okay, yeah. Now, Kellogg had a change in leadership right here, right? And John Church says, this is the way we're going to drive this. He started really active sales and operations planning. He started horizontal processes. He brought on people. They started using planning. They were one of the strongest implementers of SAP, but they said, we aren't going to depend on consultants. We're going to build our own teams, and we're going to do it the right way. They stayed on ECC 5. They built analytics, and they worked on outside innovation with suppliers. And I think it matters, right? I think this is a case study of the basics that matter, and it doesn't happen without leadership. Yeah.
And have you fed back these figures to them?
Yes.
Okay, and therefore are they now continuing, because with that in mind,
Yes.
it seems to be a very useful trend indicator, doesn't it?
Yes.
That
Right.
says that what you're doing actually has actually had an impact.
So I actually had meetings with both Kellogg and General Mills because I wanted to be sure that they would agree with the numbers, right? Because there's all kinds of issues of balance sheets. There's a restatement, maybe I got the figures wrong. And I had a meeting of about 35 people from the company, and I presented the figures, and of course it's a pretty big deck. And they said, wow, we hadn't thought about it that way. The other thing they said is, while they have improved operating margin and they've improved revenue per employee, if you look at my effective frontier, they did not reduce inventory. And I don't have that slide up here. And they said, we've gotten sorted with the program, and in 2012, we're going to balance inventory too, right? And so when I showed it to Kellogg, they're like, yes, we have really struggled with business leadership over this period of time. It shows in our numbers. Yeah. So there's no substitute for leadership. And there's no substitute for supply chain leaders speaking the language of business. So in the book, about every page, I give you a quote from one of the pioneers, or I give you a case study. And they're not the traditional case studies of Zara, right? They're very much about real people doing real things. And my very favorite quote in the book was from Marty Kislick. Sorry, Hugh. It was from Marty Kislick, and he's head of FMC supply chain for AgriSciences. And his quote was that supply chain leadership can't happen in less than 3 years. The transformation programs take time, that these are very complex systems that require orchestration. And so in the book, I try to tell you a lot of stories, a lot of quotes, and try to make it very much about the language of business. Because I think it's sad that people think supply chain's so boring. Yeah. Yes, Sarah?
What kind of skills do you think need to be taught in universities to teach that systemic thinking? Because I think it's so different to a chain.
Yes.
and I just wonder what kind of things would really help the companies today. What kind of skills would really help?
So your first question is, how do we teach systemic thinking? You know, I don't know if you've ever studied how people learn, right? But I think a lot of that is experiential learning. And so, you know, simulations, you know, using network design tools or inventory simulators, I think are very helpful for people to understand trade-offs. One of the issues of the executive teams is they don't understand that you just can't take one metric in isolation, that they're connected. And so I work with a lot of organizations that have the inventory program of the year, right, where they pluck inventory out. But I say to them, what is the potential of your supply chain? What is the right role of inventory before you go put these arbitrary targets, right? And they look at me like I have 5 heads. And I say, you know, how does it affect your other trade-offs, right? And they don't know. But I think if we teach students through simulators, experiential exercises, and whether we use, you know, simple tools like Arena or, you know, or more complex tools, you know, which are out there, then we can help people to see that. So the first thing is experiential learning. The second thing is, I think, case studies. I don't think we've been disciplined enough to use the balance sheet, teach the kids the language of business, and teach them about the effective frontier and how to power up that effective frontier, and use real case studies of real companies, right? General Mills and Kellogg are examples of manufacturing companies, right? They didn't ride the e-commerce wave, right? This is not Amazon or Zara or Apple. These are, you know, old-fashioned companies. Let's teach them what they did, and so they can learn from it, right? And the third thing is, I think that we have to help the kids to think more holistically, right? And what is supply chain leadership? Those are my thoughts. Anybody else have any ideas? I don't teach students, but I do a lot of teaching of executives. Yeah. The program of the month. And I also think there are an awful lot of consultants out there that don't understand this either. I tell people that one of the things I learned in writing the book, and I just wrote a blog about this, is I trained for a triathlon during the year that I wrote the book. And a lot of times I would start writing a chapter and I would get to about 3,000 words. And I would go back and I'd rewrite those 3,000 words, and every chapter was 12,000 words, and I would get stuck. And I would write, and I'm a natural writer, so I love to write, and so I would rewrite those 3,000 words, and then I would go to the pool and I would swim my mile, and suddenly things would get clearer, and then I would be up to 9,000 words, and then I would overwrite, and I would be about 16,000 words. But in the course of that writing, I had a real hard talk with myself, that I had basically told the world a couple of lies. You know, I'd been an analyst for 9 years. And in the data, I unknowingly had told the world a couple of lies, and I felt very bad about that. The first lie I had told them was that the tightly integrated supply chain would be the best supply chain. But as I trained for the triathlon, because I wasn't an athlete, and it had been years before I'd run or swam, I could not get out of bed. I was training for strength, but my flexibility and balance were just horrible, right? And I had to train for flexibility and balance. And it really made me think about the fact that over the last 10 years, we have automated strength in the supply chain, but we have not consciously defined agility, flexibility, and balance, and we have not purchased systems for that. And so as I started training for the triathlon, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have made the links of the supply chain inflexible at the links, and we break it, and we need to be conscious about that. The second thing I learned was that it takes discipline. And it takes, days that you want to get out of bed, right? And supply chain is very much about discipline. And it's very much about running on the days that you don't want to run. And, it's about discipline. And supply chain is very much about discipline. But the other thing I figured out that I had told the world a lie about was that we had reduced cost, and we had reduced inventory, and we had reduced customer service. And I'll never know if we truly impacted customer service. But we didn't reduce cost, and inventories have gone up, and we need to be held accountable for it. And we need to help people to understand that it's not okay. I believe that supply chain saves the world. I believe that it's the answer for really helping the planet. I believe it's the answer for moving healthcare from efficient sickness to health and wellness. I believe it's the answer for why we can get better supply to outstripping demand for foodstuffs. And we need to be true to tell the story and tell it right and to be true to the balance sheet. And it's a lot like training. So anyway, so that's a little bit about some of the research that we did. Questions?
Truth is an interesting thing, isn't it? And getting the truth to the boardroom when systemically it's set up not to hear it. In the sense that, I had one CEO said to me once, we put all this money into forecasting, but I can't get the truth out of my people. Well, the truth was his board didn't really want to hear the truth because they kept on coming up with numbers he didn't like.
Well, I think forecasting is one of the most misunderstood areas of the supply chain. We've had just terrible lies that we've told about forecasting. The concept of one number forecasting should never have been put out there because the forecast is many numbers and we need to agree on a common plan. And it isn't the exact number, it's the probability of the number we really need to use. And, we need to embrace the forecasting process and drive continuous improvement. And in the book, I talk about forecast value add processes to really drive continuous improvement. But we never educated people on forecasting processes. And so, as we think about the evolution of forecasting, and what we do in the evolution, it's a really important area. It's one of the biggest areas to fix because people are much happier with the supply chain execution system of warehouse management and transportation management than they are with planning. And one of the biggest issues is the forecasting and, our lack of putting it together right. Unfortunately, we put in forecasting to answer the question of what should manufacturing make. And we're modeling dependent demand versus independent demand. And so as we think about the redesign outside in, we've got to model independent demand, and we've got to work on sense and shaping. And those are concepts that people don't understand very well. I'm writing a blog post tomorrow where I was trying to tell SAP about that last week, and they're not very happy with me. So, so bear with me, but I have a lot of, energy around that topic. Well, let's continue. I'll show you a few more pieces of research for the book. Unfortunately, this is pharmaceutical companies. They're laggards in the industry. You can see some of the results. There is no clear leader in the pharmaceutical industry. And this is what happened in looking at inventories, average days of inventories per industry. And this is what I say, we've really got to be true to our balance sheets, right? Next. So in the book, I put forward this model. And this was part of my learning over the time I was an analyst at AMR. Originally, I believed that the most efficient supply chain was the most effective supply chain. And in the discussions with the pioneers, one of the things that I heard as a pattern was when we made the most efficient supply chain, which was the lowest cost per unit and the shortest cycles, we made a very inflexible supply chain, and it wasn't able to balance customer service. And so as people tried to trade off the efficient supply chain for the responsive supply chain, for the right product, right place, right time, they had to make trade-offs. But the resilient supply chain, which is often talked about for the people that really embrace risk management, which is the ability to absorb demand and supply volatility, also required a series of trade-offs around buffers, the design of the supply chain, and that required another set of trade-offs. And the only industry that was resilient out of the Great Recession was the high-tech and electronics industry. And then I wrote at AMR Research for 6 years on demand-driven supply chains. If you Google demand-driven supply chains, You'll be hard-pressed to find anybody that's written as much about it as I have. But we haven't moved very far in it, and the reason we haven't moved very far is people don't understand it. Demand-driven says you will reduce the latency of the channel demand signal, which when you look at demand-driven, the average time for an order for consumer products is 14 days from a store. By the time somebody buys something at Tesco to the order replenishment comes to Unilever is 14 days. And we build our systems for a signal with a lot of latency. We build our systems for orders and shipments, assuming that orders and shipments represented demand. The only way to take latency out of the system is to move to channel sensing and to use things like downstream data and warehouse withdrawal and social signals, and to be able to model independent demand. That is a huge disconnect from what we installed in the last 10 years. And for that reason, we've not moved very far on demand-driven. The other thing is we have to be accountable for demand shaping, and there's 7 demand shaping levers in the industry. There's price, trade promotions, sales incentives, marketing programs, new product launch, and the movement through of obsolescence and markdowns. But demand shaping programs have to look at the whole, and they have to be really incorporated into revenue management. And unfortunately, because we incent most salespeople on volume, they don't really want us to be accountable for it. So for example, in consumer products, only 52% of trade promotions are ever evaluated. And one of the reasons is there are a lot of salespeople that really don't want to have them evaluated, right? So we've not made a lot of progress on demand-driven, and high tech and electronics is the only industry that has really moved forward on resiliency. But in the book I say if we want to be future-looking, we have to really think about the concepts of market-driven. And so as we move this out and move this slide, I want to talk to you a little bit about this because some of you also teach marketing. And this is very different from marketing-driven. Right? Marketing-driven is really driven by the marketing organization around programs and around campaigns. Market-driven is the ability to sense and respond. And in the book, I write about a couple of concepts that I think are real important as we think about the race for Supply Chain 2020. One is building strong horizontal connectors. The waste in the supply chain is between the links and between the functions. And building these strong horizontal connectors of revenue management, sales and operations planning, supplier development, and corporate social responsibility changes the discussion. The next is continuous testing and learning. One of the things I write about in the book are advanced forms of analytics, learning systems, test and learn, and the ability for us to learn horizontally and to implement learning systems. And then the third is this concept of orchestration. I believe that the supply chain should never have been tightly integrated, that it required synchronization, and that we'll have new forms of analytics that will help us to orchestrate demand and supply, both supply risk and demand risk. So let me give you an example. In the book, I give you a case study of Cargill beef. There are 197 ways to cut up a cow. Yeah, all the things you learn right in a book. And so Cargill beef, when they plan what kind of cows to have on the feedlot, and S&OP, they look at, are we buying, steaks or hamburgers, and they actually will go through an optimization routine to orchestrate demand and supply volatility horizontally to say, how do I cut up these cows, and what kind of cows should I have in the feedlot next? I was in a grocery store in the States, and pecan sandies were on sale on buy one, get one free. I don't know if you've looked at pecans, but they're through the roof. That particular manufacturer was basically promoting what they promoted last year, very, very high cost, and they will lose profitability. And so as we think about demand orchestration, we have to really think about what's happening in the commodity markets. And how do I orchestrate, whether it's alternate suppliers, alternate design in the network, alternate bills of material, or changing demand shaping to be able to raise the discussion. And so in the book, I write about this model, and I've actually gotten a lot of feedback about this model and the evolution of supply chain thinking. And so I believe the next step is market-driven, which is really new forms of analytics, and that people should build teams that really help them to use new forms of analytics that are coming along. And I talk about the evolution of new terms like rules-based ontologies and learning systems and artificial intelligence. and systems that sense and pattern recognition. And it's also my hope you teach the students about these terms as well. Yeah? Questions? It's always nice if it's a dialogue versus me just talking.
Can I raise one?
Yeah.
We're talking about, well, you mentioned 14 days from Unilever to Tesco. I don't work for Tesco, but I do work for another retailer.
Uh-huh.
I cannot believe it's anything like that. I would imagine it's day 1 for day 3 maximum. So that building all these complex learning systems, I think between most large retailers and large CP manufacturers, it's pretty much continuous replenishment.
Well, many people think that, but it isn't. So just bear with me. Because the retailer will basically pay the manufacturer when the goods are at the warehouse. And that's when we actually have cash payments. But if you look at, we've said we've collaborated, we really have not. Retail inventories and consumer products retail inventories have not gone down. And one of the issues as we get the redefinition of the supply chain with Amazon, we're really being asked to redesign center store differently. But as we look at that use of point of sale data, and the first use of point of sale data was in the late 1980s, there is no place in a consumer product system to really effectively use that data. People implemented vendor managed inventory and CPFR, but the data only stayed in the sales teams because it doesn't go to the enterprise teams. And so you might say, well, why is it 14 days, Laura? Well, it's 14 days because I buy something at the shelf and it has to trigger a reorder point, which then goes to the warehouse, which then has to trigger a reorder point, which then goes to consumer products company, which the average lead time is 3.5 days, and they have to manage it out of their manufacturing system. And by the time you add the math up, for a normal item in the center of the curve, it's 14 days. For somebody like Coca-Cola or PepsiCo that are doing direct store delivery, it could be 2 days. For somebody like Allergen or Claritin on the long end of the tail where you don't really replenish that often, it's 30 days. And so that translation of demand is a big issue.
Yeah, but if the manufacturer has appropriate buffering, that then becomes, and I appreciate the laugh because I suffer with the lack of appropriate buffering, but that should be a cut point. You shouldn't have to worry about the manufacturing lead times. It should be there. So that the day 1 for day 2 or day 3, whatever, should go through. And certainly in UK retail, most large retailers are now much more day 1 for day 2 from store, from central warehouse to store normally on a daily basis.
I love the dialogue. Let's continue, because what happens is the consumer packaged goods guys think they have a good idea, so they promote the item. So they distort demand by promoting the item, which means that it'll go up and it'll go down. The second thing that's happened is the number of items in the portfolio of the consumer products company over the last decade went from an average of 3,300 to 5,200. So we had a lot of product proliferation. And also the retailers wanted to do things differently. They didn't want to just have the same products in London as maybe at the top of England. And so we got a lot more store assortment, a lot more complexity. So you may not think that these advances in analytics will help, but as we look at the complexity in either the product portfolio or the channel translation to be able to manage things more globally or region specifics, it gets pretty complex with old math.
I agree completely with the complexity, but I'm just looking back over our history, and we've definitely taken stock out.
Yep.
We've definitely taken stock out, and we've definitely got massively more complex with individual unique ranging for every store, and massive SKU proliferation from all our favourite suppliers.
Well, good for you, but you're an exception if you have, because most companies have not really taken stock out at the balance sheet level, right? I think the next slide, let's see, this is a definition of market driven, but I've done a lot of writing about companies and they really have not. So who do you work for?
Well, duty free.
Okay.
The airport retailers in the UK.
Yeah, I know duty free. So I'd be glad to run your benchmark data. Just give me your card and, we'll run your benchmark data and we'll see. I'll run it on the effective frontier and let's have the discussion. Yeah.
Please please buy when you fly out.
I do, absolutely, yeah, yeah. So
Demand's moving there.
yeah. So this is the definition of market-driven value networks. And so on the front cover, I talk about market-driven value networks and the fact that we must transform the language of business. So questions? I love the question, by the way. I also didn't know about demand latency, right? Until I really started working on it. Yeah?
When you're talking about kind of second generation, third generation, I guess we were running with a model of one size fits all. And there's a lot of conversation these days around segmentation in lots of different forms. How does that play into your message and your story?
Well, I think we don't have good systems for segmentation. Very few people know the cost of goods. Only 23% of companies actually have profitability modeling that they're happy with. Only 10% of companies are happy with their what-if analysis, much less, cost of a customer or cost of product portfolio analysis. And so in this orchestration model, I think one of the things we've got to orchestrate is complexity around portfolios and customer requests, and we're not really good at that right now. And I see some pretty cool technologies that are coming around complexity and being able to look at trade-offs on this effective frontier. Other questions?
And I'm sure Martin from Toolsville will say, but we've been pushing what-if analysis since the time we had the ability with scheduling systems way back when. So why aren't companies doing it 30 years on?
So Tools Group will do a portion of the supply chain for what-if analysis, but originally we had a lot of issues with in-memory processing. I don't know if you remember back in the I2 days where 64-bit was a big deal and we couldn't really push it into memory, and if we did, it would take us 24 hours to spit something back out. Now we're able to do a lot more modeling in memory, and people just haven't adapted their tools to do simulation of what-if analysis, and the scope needs to be larger than just distribution and forecasting. The other thing, Hugh and I were having lunch, I think that we've been lulled to sleep with lean and we've forgotten some of the theory of constraint work. The original concepts of theory of constraints incorporated a lot of the lean concepts. But as we've gone kind of head over heels in love with lean, I think we've forgotten all the constraints of the supply chain. And originally, theory of constraints was very focused on manufacturing, but today we have many more constraints in transportation. The original concepts of theory of constraints were, if I looked at the constraints in manufacturing, distribution would always be there, and I think that's no longer true. Yeah.
I've noticed over the years a real fashion in executive circles for simplicity, and I do think a lot of executives are really taken by just simple concepts, and do you think that's part of the reason why a lot of them just don't really wrap their heads around this stuff? I mean, it's you can make simple explanations about it, but systemic thinking requires an understanding of chaos and complexity and things that executives don't really like that much. I mean, do you think there's any
Well, I think that
hope for executives to get
Well, I
this?
think part of the problem is us,
Yeah.
in that we can't talk the language of business, and we've not held ourselves true to the balance sheet. I think that another problem is most of the supply chain executives never had a course in supply chain. I think the third issue is that the supply chain got defined very narrowly as a department or as an application, not really looking at a way of doing business. And I actually find in Europe more often than any other place in the world where I speak, and I talk about the value chain, and I talk about supply chain, and I talk about end-to-end, that the folks in the European audience to a higher degree will raise their hand and say, but supply chain has no power to do that. Supply chain has no power to cross over, sales and marketing. And so my belief is that, we've defined it pretty narrowly, right? And the original concepts of customers, supplier, aren't well understood. But that's my observation. Yes?
Your slide on Kellogg's, when the cost of grain was going up, a lot of that was due to manipulation in the market. So,
Yes, it was.
yeah, you know, your producer is being held to ransom by gamblers.
Well, yes, there was some of that, right? And I think that that's going to always happen, right? We're always going to have opportunists. And so I think that's why this concept of market-to-market, buy and sell side translation really is important. So one of the cases of Kellogg versus General Mills is they're both very good at trade promotion management, which is looking at how do I manage either discounts or trade tactics when they go to retail. But during the time where we were being held hostage on the rising commodity prices, General Mills promoted wheat-based products. Kellogg promoted corn-based products. Now, Kellogg promoted corn-based products because that was history. General Mills did a better job of orchestration against volatility. We may not have known why we were being held hostage, but we knew that corn was going through the roof. And so it's another example of orchestration.
How do horses and beef fit into this?
Horses and beef are very much, you know,
I'm sure you can cut a horse just as many ways.
yeah, as you can beef, right? Well, and, you know, let's go to a couple of other slides. So, you know, one of the issues is, you know, I think we don't have best practices. I think we have emerging practices. You can see in the horse meat issue that we had, right? And I think that supply chain practices are a lot like this guy on this moving sidewalk, where the sidewalk's moving, but he's being propelled faster by, you know, how business is changing. And so if we go forward, you know, one of the pieces of research that I'm doing right now, and I talked a little bit about that, is sustainability and management of the entire value network next. And so, you know, this is a dilemma, is that, you know, only 20% of companies are really looking at the entire value chain, even though they've said corporate social responsibility and they tie it to brand promises, and we're really not able to manage the whole supplier value chain. And so if we go forward, you know, the sustainability guys feel like they have a much better understanding of supply chain than the supply chain guys feel that they have with sustainability. And if we look at the design of the 2020 supply chain, we're going to be dealing with unit-based tracking, serialization, and field to fork to a much higher degree than we are today. And so this whole redesign outside in of the supplier network is huge. Yes?
You said there, with when it comes to redesigning supply chain, there was like a 3-year thing. If you're doing a lot of real-time data, is there any risk of sort of reacting to a short-term point of view, just thinking you've got also a number of, say, private equity companies sitting on boards, etc., any kind of shareholder activism that you might have good leadership that gets then subsequently overruled based upon reacting to that real-time data?
Well, I think that that's a real concern. Thank you for coming, sir. You know, people tend to react to knee-jerk, right? And so how we build reliability into these systems is really important. And so I think that the prominence of corporate social responsibility at a board level may drive pace of change faster, may change the discussion on supply chain to a higher degree, may raise the level. But it still takes time to change people and process, and you know, but it doesn't happen overnight. But we have to be careful because the metronome of the supply chain is speeding up, and we can overreact, right? And that requires leadership. And then if we go to the next slide, you know, one of the issues is that when push comes to shove, right, more people will tilt for, you know, supply chain than corporate social responsibility, and so this is part of the dilemma.
No, I mean, ultimately that's driven by being a corporation, isn't it?
Yeah, we're not nonprofits, right? And but I think also there is not a good governance model of how do I make trade-offs. It's a lot of times it's ad hoc, and the corporate social responsibility guys report through different organizations, and you know, not really tied into a systemic process like sales and operations planning, and we don't have really good, clear supply chain strategy. So this is actually a webinar that I'm working on for Friday, and you know, we do monthly webinars every month. Other questions?
Does that assume, though, that supply chain versus CSR is a trade-off? Surely good supply chain is good CSR.
Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. You know, in the early stages of corporate social responsibility, we're all saving costs, reducing waste, and the world is happy. But when we get more mature, often we have to redesign the value network, and we've got to ask ourselves about higher priced suppliers, right? And that's tougher, right? And, you know, so as long as we can manage profitability and save the planet, everybody's happy. But sometimes we've got to go the other way, right? And that's harder, and that really requires supply chain strategy and what does it mean at a brand promise. You know, if we think about labor and what we've done with labor and labor arbitrage, you know, it's been hard for people to walk away from low-cost labor. We see many cases of supply chain failure around labor. So early on in the maturity of CSR, it's easy to get alignment. Later on, it's much harder. Questions?
If it's integrated into their corporate sort of vision, and they don't comply with it, then they're guilty of fraud.
You would think that, right? I think that we have many companies that are vulnerable right now because we don't take end-to-end responsibility. Because if you look at renewable accounting, you know, 60 to 70% of the resource management of the supply chain is really outside the four walls, and most companies are only really taking responsibility at a policy and practice level within the four walls, and yet they have statements that extend past the four walls. And I think that's an issue, and I think we'll start to see some issues happen as we learn by failure.
Make sure they have sufficient deniability.
Well, you know, we do have a ton of lawyers, right? So is this interesting? Is what the book's about, yeah. So,
I'll ask a question. You talked some good case studies there of the various types of companies, but the impact of the e-commerce world, what do you feel is going to happen to their policies, their ways of doing things? Because that's going to drive a huge change.
I think e-commerce is fascinating because if you look at revenue per store, there's only one store I found that has actually improved revenue per store, right? And the center store of grocery is being hollowed out, right? Today in Baltimore, Amazon delivers my Kleenexes and my paper towels, and you know, and I never thought about that before, and they deliver it for free on Amazon Prime, right? And so suddenly, you know, e-commerce is 2 to 3, sometimes 5% of these consumer packaged goods companies. But more importantly, it opens up a whole new era of disintermediation, right? In the 2001 period when e-commerce started, you know, manufacturer was more of a manufacturer and a retailer was more of a retailer. But now, as we are opening up e-commerce broader, it opens up the question around disintermediation, and why not sell directly to consumers now? And why not sell with services? And so we're going to start to see a lot of transformation of models in a very different way than you've seen before. And particularly, you know, what's going to happen in the high-tech and electronics market. You already see that with Apple. And one of the things that Apple and Dell did when they built their channels was they have daily data daily. And so, you know, we're going to see a lot of change there. So I think we're not done with this whole e-commerce era. I think it's going to cause 5 changes. Redefinition of stores, disintermediation, really wonderful demand sensing signals that come from that channel earlier than any other, and we can mine. 4th, I think the e-commerce vendors are really going to drive new forms of analytics that are going to redefine master data management and, you know, real ability to think in these learning systems I talk about. And the 5th thing I think is we're going to start to see cross-channel activities where e-commerce isn't, you know, e-commerce, so really looking at, you know, true cross-channel. And I think that's real exciting because underneath it all is supply chain, and it will mean more because it's tied to the business models.
Laura, if I may, you've mentioned Amazon a couple of times. How much attention do you think we should be paying to the Amazon effect?
Oh, I think it's huge. I think it's huge for all those 5 reasons. I think Walmart gets up every day worried about Amazon, right? This book, Bricks Matter, is now in its 2nd edition. And I have 12 reviews on Amazon.com. I know 2 of them. but others I connected through on social networks, and I actually saw when they got their book. They would send me an email. I got the book, right? And then they would send me feedback on the book. And every day I can go to Amazon and I can look at how well this book's selling, right? And I can look at what they're promoting. It's fascinating from a personal experience to watch the whole Amazon effect, right?
We feel the pressure transferred from our American colleagues to the UK, but I think in the UK, it's still below the horizon. I think the impact that Amazon is having on the UK market is still
Maybe.
a bit in the shadows still.
However, this book got to the Shell employees in Malaysia, and it got to, got me the speaking engagement in Croatia. The Croatian government invited me. I would never have known that, right? A woman by the name of Branka reached out to me, who I don't know, and I'll meet off the airplane, who convinced the government that I really needed to come and talk to these emerging people, The guy by the name of Tanguay in Paris ordered it, and he gave it to his friends in Russia, and the Russians called me, and the guys in Brazil bought it, So I don't think that would have happened without Amazon, But I think, yes, it's not as a big impact as what's happening here, but it's huge in the States. The Amazon effect is huge. Well, I was supposed to talk for 30 minutes. I think I've filled 30 minutes worth. I'll be glad to sign anybody's book that wants me to. I'd love to have your feedback on the book. Thank you for letting me speak. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a few thank yous. First of all, thank you to London Metropolitan University and the staff here, to Anjali and Christine for hosting us here this evening. Thank you to Tools Group for bringing you here, Laura.
Thank you very much.
And for sponsoring tonight's event. Thank you all for attending. Incredible insight, incredible experience, and razor-sharp insight into what's going on out there.
Thank you.
And we know, Laura, that this is only the first leg of a tour of Europe that you're making. So thank you for being with us and making the time to join us.
Well, thank you.
You're no stranger to London, I know, but welcome back.
Thank you.
And bon voyage for your journey tomorrow, which I believe is to Croatia.
That's
the
right.
next step.
Yep.
Can I give you this, Laura, on behalf of the Institute, please?
Thank you so much.
And a little gizmo to mark the occasion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.